Welcome back, family heads, to another rousing episode of Family Vacation. I'm your host, AJ Tsunari. Last week you heard Matt go over his top 9 favorite moments from our guest episodes. Highly recommend checking it out. It's a nice look back on some of our favorite bits so far. Keeping up the theme of Season 1 reflection, I'll be continuing my Season 1 ranking and retrospective. If you haven't listened to the first part of this project, I'd recommend checking it out, especially if you're curious about some of my least favorite albums that we've covered on the show so far. This week I'll be going through numbers 30 through 21, or albums that are pretty so-so on. But before we dive into part 2 of this project, we're going to take a little ad break, so see you in a bit. Hey Matt, you know what I love?
Steely Dan?
Well, yes, but I also love how easy it is for two goobers like us to make a podcast.
I mean, with Spotify for Podcasters, it's no wonder. Spotify for Podcasters is a one-stop shop that's got everything you need to create the perfect podcast.
That's right. Using Spotify for Podcasters, you can directly record and edit your podcast wherever you are, using their intuitive and easy-to-use website.
And once you're done editing, Spotify for Podcasters takes care of the hard part and distributes your podcast directly to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are available.
And now you can even make video podcasts available on Spotify, which gives you even more freedom to make the podcast you want, while also giving your lovely listeners a chance to see your face.
Speaking of listeners, Spotify for Podcasters also encourages fan engagement by letting you get feedback directly from your listeners with Q&As and polls made by you.
You can even make money with your podcast through ads, podcast subscriptions, and donations directly from your audience.
Spotify for Podcasters offers all of this, and it's completely free to use with no catch whatsoever.
Guys, Spotify for Podcasters made recording and distributing the family album so easy. Being able to schedule our episodes ahead of time and letting them take care of distribution took so much weight off our shoulders.
For anyone that's ever even thought about starting a podcast, we highly recommend giving Spotify for Podcasters a try.
You can download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Once again, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters.
And we're back. Let's start this thing off with number 30, Weapons of Mass Destruction by Exhibit. Much like some nights, Weapons of Mass Destruction is also a pretty weird case, as there's a lot of whiplash in terms of quality, but I feel this project is a little more consistent. The early 2000s are by no means my favorite decade for the rap genre, but there are gems on this album that legitimately go hard. Motherfucka is an instant banger with that foreboding classical piano intro, followed by these falsetto vocals and a bass line hook that leads into the verses and choruses so well. Plus, I believe a shamisen is used throughout, so bonus points for that. Criminal Set takes on a more traditional G-Funk sound that rips extremely hard, with that deep bass line and excellent flute hook during the choruses. And Judgment Day takes on a more gospel sound, with upbeat organs and keys that both juxtapose and complement Exhibit's more aggressive flow, and it works surprisingly well. So Exhibit does have the capability to make bangers, but a lot of that isn't really due to Exhibit himself. As a frontman, Exhibit's fine, and that's it. Nothing too special, but enough to get the job done. He uses an aggressive flow style that's pretty average, and never really does anything interesting with it. Exhibit doesn't really have any quirks or flair that give his bars their own unique style. He's just a very competent rapper that does the bare minimum. Though he does have some pretty good bars, with one of my favorites being the Passion of the Christ line on Judgment Day. So with this in mind, Weapons of Mass Destruction sounds like a pretty solid, if a bit average album. But then you take a look at the production, and that's where things truly get weird. While not super frequent, there are some baffling production decisions that do not mesh with the tone or even the sound of other tracks on this album. For example, Saturday Night Live is backed by this weird techno instrumental filled with miscellaneous bleeps and bloops that just do not mesh well with Exhibit's flow. Neither does Jelly Roll's falsetto vocals, but that's just a personal grievance against his vocal style. Tough Guy's hook is built around the background vocalist chanting Oompa Loompa over Exhibit's bars, and these held keys that sound like they're sampled from an old Scooby-Doo episode. Lastly, while not a production issue, Crazy Ho is just pretty misogynistic, as Exhibit and a bunch of features take turns berating the same woman. It's just kind of uncomfortable. Weapons of Mass Destruction is an oddball. It suffers from the bizarre production choices of albums ranked lower on this list, but I think they stand out more here because everything else ranges from average to pretty good. It's also just a bit too long for my liking. My original rating for this album was a 6.9 out of 10 and a B-, and I'm actually going to rank this a tier lower, putting Weapons of Mass Destruction at a C+. Next up, coming in at number 29, we've got the other half of the Beachweather combo, Chit Chat. Chit Chat is definitely an improvement over What a Drag in almost every way, especially its memorability. While still carrying the same summertime indie vibes of its predecessor, this time around everything feels more substantial, and that can easily be heard in the production. Everything just sounds more clear and upfront on this album, allowing for heavier hitting moments to actually hit heavier, while also just sounding cleaner overall. Musically, I believe this is where Beachweather shines on all of their music, and here is no exception. Home Movie sounds like a Taylor Swift B-side in the best possible way, as Santino's vocal delivery really captures the feeling of regret for a failed relationship. The syncopated vocals accompanied by the guitar mimicking Santino's vocals on Someone's Disaster is such a catchy hook. I especially love how it evolves throughout the song by adding more instruments on the following verses. And the 80s inspired keys and groovy bass lines on Goddess make this deep cut extremely memorable and catchy. Also, do I even have to mention the sax solo? It pretty much speaks for itself. If you couldn't tell, Nick Santino is a pretty good vocalist, and he is easily a highlight on every track. Same goes for Reeve Power's deep bass lines and Sean Silverman's infectious guitar riffs. So what's not to like about this album? While Beachweather still struggles lyrically on this project, and while an improvement over What a Drag, there's still nothing to write home about. Easily the weakest track on this EP, Tremors, suffers from this lackluster songwriting pretty bad, as it relies on repetition of lyrics for hooks, and some very easy rhyme schemes that make for an underwhelming track all around. Though I do like that drum beat on the chorus. What can I say, I'm a sucker for the bell of a ride cymbal. Chit Chat is a very fun summertime album, with infectious hooks and great vocal delivery, that really only suffers from some lackluster songwriting. My original rating of this album was a 7.7 out of 10 and a B-, and that still stands. B- for Chit Chat. I'd say now with Chit Chat we've reached the point of albums that I genuinely enjoyed listening to, but still have a couple problems with. And nowhere is that more apparent than number 28, Gone Now by Bleachers. So this is a very interesting project both musically and conceptually. Gone Now is a very subtle album that, while definitely having 80s influences, it never leans on them too heavily, allowing it to have its own unique identity. Which is perfect, as this album creatively explores themes of grief, nostalgia, relationships, life, and death, all over the course of a day, which can be seen as early as the opener Mickey Mantle. The dreamlike haziness of this track is the perfect way to open the album, as Antonoff's voice is primarily up front in the mix, as the music slowly becomes louder and less muffled as the song goes on, before transitioning beautifully into Good Morning. Good Morning describes the state between being asleep and awake before the weight of life can really hit you all at once. And with this existential concept comes a very upbeat and cheery instrumental that deceptively masks the heavier tone carried by the lyrics. Also of note on this track is Antonoff's use of channels. On certain sections of the song, he'll isolate the vocals to the left ear while keeping the music in the right, creating this really cool dissonance that fits the tone of the song very well. While not as apparent as this example, channel panning happens pretty frequently on Gone Now. Oftentimes there will be specific musical elements only heard in the left or right ear that adds a lot of emphasis to specific sections or moments. It's a very cool and attention-grabbing technique. So obviously Antonoff is a good producer, he's one of the biggest names out there right now. But what about the other aspects of this album? How do they hold up? Well, musically this album is pretty solid. Nothing that I'm super in love with, but it works for what it is. The instrumentals are very crisp, and while not being as emphasized in the mix as his vocals, they serve their purpose on each song very well. The aforementioned Good Morning utilizes an upbeat, standard indie pop progression, but also has this really cool funky bottle beat at the end that's a personal highlight for me. The keys on the choruses of Let's Get Married are very pleasant and really embody the spirit of spontaneity the song portrays. And the horns on I Miss Those Days are a very much appreciated addition to an almost Flaming Lips sounding song. So all in all, this album is very solid, and I think that's the only issue I have with it. On a personal level, Gone Now just doesn't really stand out to me. While the music is by no means bad, it's just not as interesting as other projects we've covered on the show. I think Antonoff is a fine vocalist, and an even better lyricist. He's a lot better than the artist that appeared in the last entry of the series, but I just prefer other vocalists, and I relate to other lyrics more. Also, the almost Imagine Dragons inspired pre-chorus on Don't Take the Money is a choice that I think is legitimately bad, but it gets a pass as it's a singular blemish on an otherwise solid album. So I think my ranking just comes down to personal taste on this one. Gone Now is a very well-made and conceptually interesting album that's produced by one of the most talented people in music right now. But it's just not my style. My original ranking for Gone Now by Bleachers was a 7.3 out of 10 and a B, and I will also be going lower on this album, but not by much. leaving Gone Now with a B-. Moving on to number 27, we've got Rock Spectacle by the Bare Naked Ladies. So this is an album that I don't really have much to say about. Much like Gone Now, Rock Spectacle is an incredibly solid album, but I think I prefer this one more since it's just more of what I like musically. As a live album, Rock Spectacle has this really warm and infectious energy that you can't help getting into, since the crowd is just so invested in the silly Canadians' performance. It creates such a comforting vibe that makes you feel like you're in the audience with them, and that is especially helped by the production. My god, this truly is one of the cleanest live albums I've ever heard. Everything sounds so clear, and the musicianship is so impressive it sounds like studio quality. Plus, the warmth of the crowd just adds an extra bit of flavor that makes the listening experience that much more pleasant. Stephen Page also has this very endearing quirkiness and charisma that makes his stage banner very funny and memorable. Highlights being the Sweetest Woman story and the green dress line on If I Had $1,000,000. Musically, this album isn't super diverse, as most songs fit into this alternative kind of folky sound, but it's still very enjoyable. If there were any low points on this album, for me it would be the track What a Good Boy. It's easily the weakest ballad on the album, and goes on just a bit too long. And a more personal gripe is the sound of Tyler Stewart's snare drum. I don't know why, but I'm just not a fan. It gives me Saint Anger vibes for some reason. Overall, Rock Spectacle is an incredibly solid album that happens to have extremely great production. It's definitely a pleasant listen, but one I'm not always clamoring to go back to. My original rating for this album was a 7.1 out of 10 and a B-, and that rating still stands. Rock Spectacle gets a B-. On to number 26, we've got Innuendo by Queen. Now this is an album I feel like I jumped the gun on for my original rating. While it's not bad by any means, when compared to other albums that are higher in my ranking, the rating for this album just doesn't really scale well with them. Plus, this album does have some stinkers. But let's go over the positives first. Surprisingly, like Life Is But a Dream by Avenged Sevenfold, I really respect the ambition and experimentation on this album. And unlike Life Is But a Dream, they pull off this experimentation pretty well. With Queen being this late into their career, and Freddie Mercury's health taking a turn for the worse, it's very admirable the band was willing to try all these different ideas and commit to them with the same energy and gusto they're known for. I'm Going Slightly Mad is my favorite track on the album, as it beautifully captures Freddie's state of mind at this point with these really breathy and almost chilling keys that the entire song centers around. I Can't Live With You harkens back to their arena rock roots, with this awesome shuffle beat that drives the whole track, as well as some harmonies that demonstrate why this band is truly iconic. While kind of a shitpost, Delilah is a sweet song about Freddie's cat that really commits to the bit through the use of the meow breakdown. And what can I say about The Show Must Go On? A phenomenal closer to this album and the perfect capstone for Queen's career. Just listen to it, it speaks for itself. Vocally, this album is exceptional. As always, Freddie Mercury delivers a breathtaking performance that's especially impressive considering he was really suffering as a person living with HIV. It truly feels like he's giving it his all, whether it be the extremely high notes he reaches on Don't Try So Hard, or the insanely commanding presence he brings on the closer. Freddie is performing his grand finale, and he knows it. Now, while this album is incredibly impressive and inspiring considering the context in which it was written, some of the experimentation on this album does not work so well. For instance, The Hitman is an incredibly cheesy track that sees Queen's take on metal, but ultimately sounds like something off the Shadow the Hedgehog soundtrack. Bijou is written as a song in reverse, with focus on the guitar solo rather than the vocals, but it ultimately leads to a very boring and meandering track that sees Brian May noodling for 3 minutes. And while not experimental per se, Headlong is Queen's traditional arena rock sound, but more so comes off like a rejected Styx track, with incredibly corny lyrics and hooks that would make Dennis DeYoung seethe with envy. But those are outliers on an otherwise very underrated album. The passion the band had for this project is real, and it just emanates triumph on almost every track. Innuendo is definitely a sleeper in Queen's discography. It has some really neat ideas, amazing performances, and encapsulates everything that made the band great all in one album. My original rating for this project was an 8 out of 10 and a high B/low A, but now Innuendo gets a solid B. Very good, but not quite great. Next up, coming in at number 25, we have Part 1 by the West Coast pop art experimental band, and I feel like this is another Innuendo situation. Again, while I do enjoy this album quite a bit, being the first album we ever reviewed on the show, it just can't really compete with some of the later entries on this list, and my rating was also just a bit too high. I guess I was just caught up in the wonder that comes with starting a podcast. But let's focus on the good again. Part 1 is essentially the all-encompassing psychedelic album of the 60s. Whether intentional or not, West Coast delivers songs that have quite a lot of influence from other bands within the movement. Most tracks sound like something, say, The Doors or The Zombies would be putting out around this time, acting as a sampler of the most popular groups and styles in the psych scene. Album opener Shifting Sands is a dark, waltzy piece with wailing, droning guitars and a stretched-out vocal delivery that is extremely reminiscent of The Doors. Transparent Day is a joyfully upbeat, folksy song with some excellent accented hits and channel panning that reminds me a lot of The Byrds. And who could forget the iconic Help I'm a Rock, which is so zany and chaotic with those goofy voices and trickling guitars. It's so obvious this was Frank Zappa's track, and I'm glad he got it on the album. It's truly a gem. Musically, this album is also very solid. There's some killer guitar work by Danny Harris, Michael Lloyd, and Ron Morgan. All of their playing comes together splendidly and complements the tone of each track very well, with highlights being the low-key, laid-back strumming on I Won't Hurt You, and the almost calm response noodling on If You Want This Love. I'd say the weakest aspect of this album is the production. It sounds very old and of its time, since not all of the instruments are mixed equally, creating passages that sound muddy on certain tracks. The constant channel shifts can also be very distracting, but it has a charm to it, and there are some very cool uses of panning that make songs like Transparent Day stand out a lot more. But at the same time, there are tracks like Lila that really suffer from these issues, as there's a really jarring instance of just everything on the right channel cutting out before cutting back in. It's a very distracting moment that does not sound intentional. In terms of the songwriting on this album, it's just okay. Nothing too groundbreaking, but serviceable for the time in which it was written. Oftentimes, these songs use very easy rhyme schemes to discuss themes about relationships, historical tragedies, and the existential horrors of being a rock. Those specific shoutouts go to the lyrics on I Won't Hurt You, a very tender song with some really cool word choices you wouldn't expect from a track like this. All in all, Part 1 is a consistently good psych album that lets you catch a glimpse of everything popular in the scene at that time, and while it's simple, it's certainly effective. My original rating for Part 1 by West Coast was an 8.5 out of 10 and an A tier, and unfortunately this drops down to a still very respectable B tier. What else to say except help, I'm a rock. Number 24, we've got The Ambassador by Gabriel Kahane, a really cool album that I'm glad Matt brought to the show because I would have never heard of it on my own. Like Gone Now, The Ambassador is also a very subtle album, but I find its stylistic choices and song topics to be a lot more interesting. Being somewhat of a concept album, The Ambassador describes experiences had in LA, and all of them sound very unique from each other, which is due in part to their composition. Kahane is a very talented composer with an extremely elegant voice that allows him to take on many different influences very effectively. The obvious example being the swanky big band number Musso and Frank that has excellent utilization of a horn section that gives the song the scummy feeling it's going for. Ambassador Hotel is an acoustic piece reminiscent of Simon and Garfunkel that really gives Kahane's vocals a chance to shine. And there's also the folksy Slumlord Crocodile that has this awesome shuffly drum beat and really powerful guitars that drive the entire song. Kahane covers a lot of bases on this project, yet still manages to unify each track with the same comfy atmosphere displayed by his vocals and the album's production. Most tracks see Kahane use this very tender and inviting tone when singing, giving off a very warm vibe that makes this album feel very cozy. Griffith Park is a great example of this, as during the chorus, Kahane uses his high range as he's backed by these really comforting backup vocals and a Wurlitzer that makes the song feel very calming. The song topics on this album are also very interesting. I mentioned previously that they are based on experiences in LA, with all of them being based in history, fiction, and Kahane's own life. Bradbury is based off Roy Batty's monologue from Blade Runner, and it beautifully captures the feeling of that scene with these swelling strings and dour piano. And Empire Liquor Mart is the standout track on this album, as it's the longest and feels like a true composition. It goes through different sections and musical motifs, describing the killing of Latasha Harlins and the LA riots from her perspective. There's really a lot to admire on this album. Kahane is a truly gifted composer and can create really powerful movements as well as very tender moments. The only negatives I can say is that some tracks that lean more on the standard ballad style, such as Veda and The Closer, are just kinda boring. But other than that, this is a really cool album I recommend checking out. It really doesn't get enough credit. My original rating for The Ambassador by Gabriel Kahane was a 7.8 out of 10 and a B, and at a B it shall stay. Coming in at number 23, we got Twin Fantasy by Car Seat Headrest. Now originally I wasn't too huge on this album, but I've come around. However, I don't really have much to say. I still feel like I missed the boat on this one since I didn't grow up listening to it, but I still appreciate it for what it is. Will Toledo and the gang deliver a very personal album exploring the dynamics of a relationship in a very cool and unique way. With incredible instrumental arrangements, deeply intimate lyrics, and interesting experimental passages, Twin Fantasy completely stands out as its own thing and isn't afraid to show it. I certainly respect the ambition for this project, especially the 2011 version, and there's no denying that the musicality is great. But there are just some songs I don't really vibe with, and I think it's a little too long. But I like it a lot more now than I did on a first listen. My original rating for Twin Fantasy by Car Seat Headrest was a 7 out of 10 and a high C/low B, and now it rests solidly at a B tier. Moving on to number 22, this might be a controversial placement, but we've got Starbomb's self-titled debut. Now I know this is way too high for a comedy album made by YouTubers, but I've got a soft spot for Starbomb. I didn't really have a defined music taste till like late high school, and I was also a massive Game Grumps fan when I was a teenager. So this album was the perfect storm of what I was looking for in music. It was made by some of my favorite content creators at the time, it was about video games, and I just thought it was funny. It's cringe looking back on how obsessed I was with this group, but at the same time, Starbomb really was the first album that I listened to front to back. In a way, it's kind of my version of Twin Fantasy. So it's this high for purely biased reasons, but that isn't to say it's without merit. As far as comedy albums go, you could do a lot worse. While the jokes are very juvenile and predictable, they've got a charm to them that's helped by the video game framing and just the personalities of Danny and Aaron. Crashervania is about Simon Belmont's true motivation for monster slaying being his jealousy at never being invited to parties. It's Dangerous to Go Alone sees Link dealing with the consequences of accepting goods from strange old men living in caves. And Kirby's Adventures in Reamland, alright, they can't all be winners. But what helps is that this album is pretty short, meaning that if a bit isn't that good, it never goes on for too long. Starbomb's song is end at the perfect time, unlike, say, Turtleneck and Chain. Musically, while this is Starbomb's weakest outing, there's still a lot to appreciate. Brian Wecht produced and I believe performed all the music on this album, and while it's your standard nerdcore synth pop, it fits the tone of the album perfectly, and it even has some really fun moments. The 8-bit synths on Luigi's Ballad really accentuate Aaron's rapping, and the sound font changes on the choruses go harder than they have any right to. The porno synths and groovy bassline on Dangerous to Go Alone work perfect with the song's concept, and that little ocarina lick to indicate Link traveling is also just a very nice touch. And the music in general and the simple plot of Final Fantasy VII is just stellar throughout. It has this really smooth, laid-back feel, with classical piano accents being backed by this awesome bass line and 16th note drum beat. Easily my favorite track on the album. Though that's definitely helped by the stars of Starbomb, the vocalists Danny and Aaron. As anyone could have guessed, the hosts of a long-running Let's Play channel do in fact have great chemistry on this album, in both their banter and their harmonies. Danny is phenomenal on every track, even when he's not taking lead. Usually taking charge during the choruses, his vocals just exude so much passion you can't help but get into it. Even his backup vocals are great and bolster each track they appear on, adding this extra layer of flavor that takes any song to the next level. But that's nothing compared to when he's taking lead. Luigi's Ballad shines the biggest spotlight on Danny's vocals and really lets him go all out in his delivery, especially during the choruses when he harmonizes with guest feature Rachel Bloom. While Danny is the obvious standout as the experienced singer of the group, Aaron still manages to hold his own through his surprisingly decent rapping and his overall personality. His sultry vocals as Link on Dangerous to Go Alone, the goofy Dracula voice on Crashervania, the sadistic and mentally scarred tales on Sonic's Best Pal, they're all really fun bits that give a great sense of Aaron's personality. Though Aaron's standout track is of course Rap Battle Ryu vs. Ken, where he plays Ryu and just verbally destroys Danny as Ken through a rapid smattering of Street Fighter references and vulgar insults. Definitely a highlight of Starbomb. So while very juvenile and cheesy, this album still holds a special place in my heart, and it also holds up surprisingly well. As a comedy album, it's one of the better ones out there. And this is just the group in their infant stages. They only get better from here. Of course, there are some drawbacks, as tracks like The Book of Nook, Sonic's Best Pal, and Kirby and Dreamland are just not as memorable or as strong conceptually as others on the album. Plus, the extreme focus on crude sexual humor can definitely be a deterrent for some listeners, though it should be mentioned that they dial it way back on future releases. But besides these smaller issues, I still really like this album and this group, and I'm very excited to see what Starbomb 4 brings. My original rating for this album was a 7.5 out of 10 and a B tier, and I still think that's very fair for Starbomb. And last, but certainly not least, coming in at number 21, we've got Mr. Bungle's self-titled. Jesus man, where do I even begin with this album? I guess I'll start by beating a dead horse, but also like Life is But a Dream, I really respect the ambition of this project. However, Mr. Bungle blows Life is But a Dream out of the water, as they actually have the chops to back up and follow through on these ideas in ways Avenged Sevenfold could only dream of. The musicality on this project is truly a marvel. Every musician brings their A-game and are able to switch styles and genres at the drop of a dime. One moment, Danny Heifetz will be plowing through a track with a thunderous metal beat, and the next, a horn section is introduced, sending the song into a ska break seamlessly. It's so impressive how effectively and consistently they pull this off. The sheer amount of ground this album covers is remarkably impressive and creative. Mr. Bungle are able to take two very different genres and blend them together perfectly, creating really unique and memorable moments. Some personal musical highlights include the funky horn section and groovy bass line on Girls of Porn, the double-time ska breaks on Egg, the syncopated circus organ accents on Stub a Dub, and the haunting studio imagery on Dead Goon. While these are just a few of many phenomenal moments, these were ones that really stuck with me long after we recorded that episode. And Mike Patton's vocals, what can I say? This man's range is utterly insane, and like the musicians on this album, he's able to rapidly switch styles so consistently. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Impressive really is the key word to describe this album. Technically speaking, it's brilliant, and there are so many little moments that make revisiting this project so rewarding. On the flip side, however, there are some ideas that just go a bit too far and really bog down my enjoyment of the album. The biggest flaw with Mr. Bungle is that it's just way too long. All of these songs are 5 minutes and over, and you can really feel every minute on certain tracks. There are times where the band gets carried away, and will just do way too much by adding in unnecessary sections that make the album feel very bloated. The most obvious examples being the sample of someone taking a shit on Slowly Growing Deaf, and the 5 minutes of Musique Concrète on Egg. Just completely unnecessary fluff that was put in for the sake of having it. Now granted, you gotta respect how far the band was willing to go on this project, as they knew they could pretty much get away with anything since Faith No More was such a hit. But from a listener's perspective, it's just needlessly in your face, and shocking for the sake of shock value. But these sore spots should not detract from the sheer talent that is contained within this album. There's something for everybody here, and even if it's not your thing, you can certainly admire the skill it took to record this project. Mr. Bungle is a very fun, if a bit unpolished album that shows off the musical chops of Mike Patton's little side project beautifully. From the masterful musicianship, insane vocal range, and disturbing song concepts, this album is definitely memorable. My original ranking for Mr. Bungle was a 7.4 out of 10 and a B tier, and I still feel the same way. B for Bungle. And that's another part of my Season 1 retrospective down. What did you guys think? Let me know what you thought about this episode, as well as all these albums that I mentioned. And as always, I'm your host, AJ Tenari. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.